for Thesis 25, which is a strangely transitional one. Junius has just talked about these divine names that apply to the whole Trinity, Yahweh, Elohim, and King of Kings, Lord of Lords. It's kind of a complex conceptual name, but he still treats it as a name. And he wants to move on now to attributes like infinity and stuff like that. But because he has said King of Kings and Lord of Lords, he thinks, there's a lot about kingship and kingdom in biblical theology. And you could get pretty confused about it. You could do this wrong. So I take Thesis 25 to be kind of a preemptive move where he's trying to sort out your categories for you in advance so you won't read the Bible wrong when you do get to these categories. So it's a guess at what he's doing here.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. The part of the other side of the story as well is that Junius, most people know today, he's very famous for developing like the archetypal theology distinction as it hits the Reformed stream. Another area that he's very famous for is also the issue of the twofold kingdom of Christ. And so this is a very, very early reference in Junius's broader work that develops from this point. Here it's just dropped into a disputation as a random thesis, somewhat random thesis, but it's quite a fascinating early reference to an idea that he will develop quite extensively and will become very important for the later Reformed Orthodox.
Okay, all right. Well, let's come back to that in a minute. Let's go ahead and get a little bit of the thesis in front of us and then explore what he's doing with it. And I apologize, I'm broadcasting from a remote location here, and my camera's in a different location, so I don't think my eye contact is going to be as good here, especially when I'm reading. And let's read. Here's Thesis 25. Christ's dominion or kingdom, to bring this forward before we move on to the attributes, is twofold, with the result that he is said to be Lord and King, each under a twofold concept as well. So we just did Lord of Lords and King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and now Junius is saying, well, kingship and lordship, he is king and lord under a twofold aspect. Maybe we need to go ahead and get the first category on the board before we say anything else. Yeah, all right. So he goes on, there is a kingdom common to the whole of the divine essence. In this common kingdom, the three persons reign in all and over all, with equal power and glory, in the unity of essence and of common external operations, infinitely and immutably from eternity to eternity.
It's complex stuff.
Yeah.
Just one of the things that I think is so important to bring forward, and it's frequently missed, is the basic move is we now have two ways we call Christ King and Lord that are grounded upon a twofold reality. So the very beginning of the thesis, he mentions this dominion or kingdom is twofold. And that's speaking of extramental reality, the participation of the creaturely order in two ways in God, both with respect to the essence, as it were, whereby we predicate, based upon that reality, kingship of all three persons. And then a second reality, which is proper to the supernatural order, insofar as that order terminates on the Son properly and distinctly from the other persons. And of course, we know all three persons are also permeating that supernatural order as well in the divine missions and the indwelling of the Trinity, but they're doing so each according to their personal property. And the reality that hangs off of the Son particularly grounds another predication of kingship and lordship that is meaningful as well. And I just find that move of twofold reality, roughly speaking, twofold conception, to be really fundamental and important.
Yeah, and it's interesting. This is one of the areas where a scholastic theologian like Junius is going to multiply a bunch of categories and kind of complicate terms that we might otherwise be used to using simply. And I'm a big fan of using terms simply when they work. But there's a lot more going on here. So Junius sort of populates the field with a lot more ways you could mean kingship. Often when a scholastic does that with a term, you feel robbed. You have to fight over the sort of emotional response of thinking, I want to go back to when I just had simple terms. In this case, I don't register that feeling as much as I think, oh, when I say Jesus is king, turns out I mean a lot of things by that. And they're all good, and they all make the move of acknowledging kingship or lordship in a way that feels very familiar and comfortable to me. But they're different from each other, and that's worth marking.
Yeah, and another aspect to this that is a mark of the very refined scholastic precision, where maybe we start, we might start feeling it gets to be almost a little pedantic or overburdensome, is this idea of twofold rather than two separately. So this becomes a very technical term, especially among the Reformed Orthodox. And as far as I know, it's grounded actually in Thomas Aquinas, who drops the duplicator, that's the Latin word, the twofoldness, always in the context of the two orders, nature and supernature, as they participate in missions and all these types of things. And you don't want to say they're two, because that is an absolute distinction. Rather, we say it's twofold, which is a relative distinction, which doesn't sever the created economy into spheres that are like globes over here and globes over here, nature and grace and these types of things, but still preserve a real distinction between them.
Yeah.
And then it goes on, and Junius also develops this very importantly off of Thomas Aquinas as well. The way these orders relate to each other, Thomas says the relation of the supernatural order sublates the order of nature. And so these are orders within orders, like a little Russian nesting doll, as it were. And all of that is being signaled in a very precise way that is important to keep intact when we think about this. Otherwise, we get off the track. A friend of mine, Jonathan Beakey, actually did his dissertation on this very topic. His work has just been published, the Duplex Regnum Christi, the twofold kingdom of Christ. And one of the major things that he brings out in his dissertation, also with Junius and the later Reformed Orthodox, is just how central this twofoldness, rather than 1 + 1 = 2, that idea as it runs through theologically.
Interesting. So when you mentioned the danger of being pedantic in the sense of like, can I be excused? I don't know. Can you? Like, properly, you should say may. Yes. This can sound like that if someone says, well, the two kingdoms of Christ, and you would want to stop and correct them and say, actually, go ahead and say the one twofold kingdom.
There you go.
Or the twofold kingdom. It may not matter to you based on the distinctions you're thinking about now, but you're going to be glad you said twofold instead of two.
Yeah, and that bleeds over into the concept of kingship that we're developing off of the basis of this reality. And the way that these two ideas of king are predicated of this one who is the Christ, the Son of God, are not strictly severable from each other. It's a very complicated notion that has a distinction running through it down the middle, as it were, continually, but it's not, we develop a whole theology of kingship over here, and then, later we do it again. All that's running through as well.
Okay, so before we move on to this second way of considering Christ's kingship, I want to focus on the kingdom common to the whole of the divine essence, because there are two things you could mean by that. If you to call God king, you could be referring to an element of the creator-creature relation, where if there's a creator and then there's a creation distinct from him and subordinate to him, he has the office or status of king over it. And so you can kind of spell that out in whatever terms are comfortable for you, or meaningful to use. But you're really talking about the difference between God and everything that's not God, that he is Lord over all. That's clear. That's definitely there. The other thing you could mean by it is that there is an attribute of kingship within the divine essence without reference to anything outside. So is it that there's a, and that's where it's hard to even talk about what would that be like if this goes all the way back to Origin, right? What Origin of Alexandria, if what would God be king over if there were nothing but God? And you could either say apophatically, I don't know, but there would be some kind of kingship because he doesn't emerge from potential king to actual king once he creates something. God's status as creator is not his self-fulfillment. Junius, so I bring all that up. I don't know what you think about that, but Junius doesn't seem to be considering that second thing I talked about at all. He seems to be thinking of divine kingship as a way of talking about the creator-creature relation.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And once again, he's pulling straight from the high medievals. Again, yeah. Thomas, ST1Q8, the existence or the ubiquity of God, where kingship is a relative name, and that's developed as the way that the most fitting way, Thomas Aquinas says, to talk about God's presence to the created order as he is most present, absolutely present, permeating, all those types of things. The most fitting way to describe that, off analogy to how things are present to others in our order, is kingly presence. And that is a relative name. It might strike people as a very weak mode of presence because a presence of a man and wife together, a mother and child, a friend to friend, like all of these seem to be much more intimate and meaningful. And this is very solemn and devoid of fellowship and communality. But rather, in the mind of the high medievals, and then especially Junius, as he's striking this idea here, the idea of kingship is related to universe and order, and especially the fact that my relationship to every creature is grounded and participated in my relationship, which is more fundamental to God himself. So by selecting this relation of kingship and this idea of kingdom and God just filling the realm of the earth, he's actually invoking every aspect of presence that a creature can have to another creature, which all of them are invoked in this mega perfection of kingship, wrapped up in this large idea of permeation of the realm that God has according to essence. And again, it's this relative name that comes to be not as a potential to actual kingship, as you mentioned very well, but when the creature is ordered to God as subject, what God is according to essence fills and posits kingship and his rule in the created order.
Yeah. Okay. Now there probably is, we know Junius likes to trace economic things back to immanent realities within God. We've seen him do that earlier in the Christology. You probably could do such a thing, but this is fairly speculative, right? Like you could take the relation of kingship, the relative attribute of kingship, and ask what is the immanent divine correlate of kingship towards that which is outside. And probably someone has made some progress on concepts which help unpack that a little bit. Junius seems to be not interested in it. And it also, I do think it takes you right to the border of what you could possibly say, like what would lordship in God be? What is God's lordship? Yeah. Considered not as a relative attribute, but as an absolute attribute. You're going to end up like just saying the divine name again.
Yeah, I think that's broadly right. There are hints though here that he's invoking the absolute ground behind the relative name, power and glory. And I think that if we would want to go down that more speculative route, that's really where we're stopping at eventually, is this idea of divine power, herrlichkeit, glory.
In the common kingdom, the three persons reign in all and over all with equal power and glory in the unity of essence. So that gets all the way back, but he's not going to talk about what that is in God himself.
Yeah.
Okay. We might be able to come back to that in a minute to sort of solve some 21st century problems. But let's go ahead and get the other aspect of this kingship of Christ on the table. So Junius has said, there is the kingdom in common to the whole, and now he moves on to the next one. There is the kingdom singular to the person of Theanthropos, the God-man, and temporal. In this singular kingdom, the person of Christ, debasing himself for our salvation, with the kingdom of common deity remaining intact, according to each nature in the unity of personal operations. Sorry, I lost my place here in the text. According to each nature in the unity of personal external operations, with a voluntary dispensation, rules in all and over all, in the church, with a kingdom advancing and changeable, whose principle and term of administrating is in time, but whose work, or apotelesma, is perfect in every way in the eternal glory and salvation of the church. Okay, one thing I noticed is Junius is throwing a lot of words at this to try to sort of get the portrait out there of what this way of talking about the kingship of Christ is. And it is a rulership connected to Christ as incarnate in his condescension or economy toward us.
Yeah, we see the magic word there, voluntary dispensation. I think we remember above when we talked about the sonship and the fact that he was not son by voluntary dispensation, but son by nature. So this is clearly squaring the contrary to this eternal sonship. We're squarely in the economy, voluntary dispensation, debasing himself, et cetera, et cetera.
Without the first one in place and remaining in place, you would run the risk of some kind of kingdom adoptionism, right? Where Christ was somehow promoted to king, but was not eternally king.
Yeah, say more on that. That's
well, yeah. If you didn't have that as the anchor, then you would be telling the story of how the Son of God came forth and became incarnate, and then turned into the one who had kingship over the church and eventually over the world. One of the problems with that is it tangles up Christ's divine status with the progress of his work as something to be achieved. And that would mean when you read the Gospels, you wouldn't be reading about Jesus as king until he completed his work and was exalted and enthroned. And you'd say, oh, well, now that he has been exalted to the right hand of God and taken his seat, now he's king. But Jesus in Nazareth was not king. It's something he achieved. One problem with that is the advance of the kingdom of God continues through world history under the ascended Christ. And so it's the worst kind of adoptionism, because you'd have to put off his achievement of kingship to the end of time.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like that would be like a different version of like Photinus, the Photinian heresy, the early church with similar types of themes. He becomes Messiah at the end.
Yeah.
Types of things.
Yeah, that would be a problem. If on the other hand, you kept the common kingship in place, but didn't kind of spend the time that Junius spends here opening up this economic, theanthropic, and as long as we're using terrible words, apotelesmatic kingship, then you would be trying to solve every question of kingship only with the common triune kingship category. And that wouldn't make sense of everything happening in the New Testament. So
there would be times in the New Testament where we would not be certain what reality is grounding this predication of kingship. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because you would just refer everything to directly to the common divine kingship, and it wouldn't fit the incarnate ministry.
Got it.
Yeah. So it's interesting that Junius doesn't bring this up, because he's functioning at some kind of dogmatic level instead of, even when he's explaining how the Bible works, he he's still not, he's not certainly not doing commentary. And he's not even bringing up all the problem passages sort of systematically. But my mind immediately goes to the 1 Corinthians 15 passage about that when the end shall come and the Son will hand over the kingdom to the Father. This just really messes with Bible people, especially it's almost a telltale verse where you can realize when you've been just functioning with narrative categories and not operating with any ontological categories, when the Son hands over the kingdom to the Father, all of a sudden everything in your head blows up and you think, wait, I thought the Son was eternally God and eternally King. How is he handing the kingdom over to the Father and God being all in all?
Right. Would this also relate a little bit to like the eternal functional subordinationist controversy? Do they do something similar?
I think so, because when someone is trying to figure out when someone has decided to use categories of power and authority to explain the difference between the Father and the Son as such, at the highest level, then their mind is going to go to a couple of things Paul's dealing with in 1 Corinthians, including the Son handing the kingdom back to the Father.
Right.
Because that seems to be a place where you recognize a priority of the Father. And if you've decided the difference between the Father and the Son is rule and authority, then 1 Corinthians 15 is going to sort of explain everything for you, but also is going to cause you lots of problems with how to maintain a full deity of Christ. It's where the subordinationistic tendency, the ontological subordination tendency of eternal functional subordination really sort of comes out in the open.
So I guess this brings my mind here to this really unique parenthesis in this very long sentence, with the kingdom of common deity remaining intact.
Yeah.
That idea is so fundamental as that prior eternal ontological, if you want to use that word, ground that is being opened up and in a fitting way matched by the economy and this dynamic reciprocity of receiving and then giving back to the Father, and et cetera, et cetera. But all of those are enacted and reified as a move from potency to act. We can go down those roads and all those sorts of things in time.
Yeah.
Grounded upon something eternally, which does not have any when we pick up the creaturely economy, we lose the creaturely components of that, and therefore this subordination, this economic voluntary dispensation, this giving of the Father to the Son, all these types of themes. Among the Reformed as well, they talk a lot about the eternal covenanting. There's a lot of that type of language in Scripture, and there's many ways that you can go with that sort of thing. The point is that there are aspects of the scriptural text that require the economic, theanthropic human nature to ground, and then there are aspects when you zip up into the immanent Trinity that are no longer there, even though it's the basis and the eternal root that's being, as it were, expanded. Time.
Yeah, I know. In Hebrews scholarship, Bobby Jameson does this in his book, "The Son Who," about the Son who became Son.
Yeah, is it the Son who learned obedience? Is that?
No, that's a Hebrews phrase, but I think that's Glenn Butner's book. That's more about against eternal functional subordination. Bobby's book just kind of uses classical Christological categories to work through how is it that he's eternal Son and all things were made through him, and yet he in some way takes on this sonship as the story of Hebrews unspools. I think that's present in lots of ways. We're working with it here in the category of kingship and lordship. How is Jesus eternally king, always was king as a statement about the creator-creature relationship.
Yeah.
And yet, in some ways, condescends to kingship and takes on this kingship and executes this kingship until it's carried out. I think that this is built into lots of ways you have to think about the Bible. It's one of these prompts where you're reading scripture and you think, I have to think larger about this, more largely than I had been inclined to. I think it reaches a crisis point in the modern period, and I want to say that broadly, maybe reaching all the way back to into the Protestant scholastic period. As soon as world history and the development of the world process starts to capture so much attention that it's tempting to think of the divine being developing itself and coming to itself in world process.
Sure.
Then all these categories have to be brought out again and kind of used more carefully, because you want to do justice to the process of world history without involving the absolute God in it in such a way that God is waiting for the outcome of world history to constitute God's self.
Yeah, and I've noticed as well there's a more subtle version of this. So you can do the Hegelian absolute spirit, God essentially speaking, coming to his own in this tangle of world history and self-actualization. I see all the time that exact idea is present in Trinitarian theology. So maybe we have the essence of God squared away and we understand, this is not going on. There's no, bubbling soup up there in the divinity. But as soon as we get to Trinity, and especially like language of covenant or this voluntary dispensation or twofold kingship, that's where everything is re-injected in just a different key, and the same problem results. And even deeper problems in many ways, because then you've actually severed Trinity. Then you actually fall prey to Rahner's critique of the De Deo Uno, De Deo Trino, the one God, the threeness of God is this massive gap in separation, that's mediated by the realm of history.
Oh yeah, right. Because there you'd have some kind of construct where you're thinking of the one God, De Deo Uno, the treatise on the one God, as being about the stability and eternal identity of God. But De Deo Trino is somehow the salvation historical working out and actualizing in process.
Yes.
Yeah. And I guess I'm starting to notice that Hegel, gigantic thinker that he was really just one of the people trying to solve this larger problem. Like sort of what drove him to do the constructive things he did was asking this question: how do you relate the process of world history to the absolute? But you see that coming on strong, certainly by the 18th century, it's beginning to reach this sort of fever pitch of the world is so complex and interesting and forward moving and developing. Surely this must entail something about the very nature of God. At that point you want to say, I mean, yes and no, kudos for noticing how fascinating world history is. But you don't want to actually put off God's self-constitution or however you want to talk about it. You don't want to put off the identity of God as the absolute until world history is worked out.
Yeah, and it becomes particularly tempting because Christ is the theanthropos in the Fathers, like Maximus and also Thomas. This idea of cosmic Christ, it's very difficult to put it in these types of terms, but it is correct. He's the guy that stands at the end, that gives the dynamic drive to the whole world process of the final form at the end, pulling everything into this Christ standing at the top of the created order now. And this becomes even more tempting to dial Trinity into those terms as well.
Right. Yeah, but it causes lots of confusion. Yes, he is Omega, but also he was already Alpha.
Yes.
So there can be an expansion of our understanding of the identity of Christ here, but you won't get to it by giving up what we already properly understood about his eternal identity. So, and maybe the last thing to say on the eternal functional subordination error here is, I guess one way to talk about it is it takes the lordship relation, which is properly a creator-creature distinction, and it uses those categories to talk about a Trinitarian distinction. That is to say, it asks the question, what's the difference between the Father and the Son? And fundamentally wants to answer it by saying it's some kind of command and obey lordship at the level of their personal wills, or the personal inflection of the divine will, that belongs distinctly and severally to each of them. There's some kind of the opposed relation that Father and Son stand in is somehow a relation of command and obey, or of lordship in some higher way. And that's where I just say, no, that this whole category of lordship is built into the creator-creature relation.
Mm.
And if you use it to answer a properly Trinitarian question, it's just going to be productive of all kinds of confusion.
Fred, that is so insightful. So let me just make sure I'm understanding you right, that if we articulate the two relations in terms of Lord and subject, backfeeding these two ideas of Lord and subject to define what the persons are in relation to themselves, this collapses into a really bad place. And it would seem to me that it actually collapses necessarily onto an absolute distinction. So it doesn't preserve any relative. So Lord and servant are relative terms, but it's a type of relation founded upon order, which would require an absolute essential distinction as its ground, rather than Father and Son, which are also relation. That is very, very striking.
Yeah, and then you have to try to redo all the work that the classic tradition did with Father-Son, because you could say, how can he eternally be Son? That introduces some sort of fromness or origin. That sounds like a creator-creature relation, that the creation is that the creator is the origin of the creation.
Right.
But we've done all that in a tremendous amount of work with Nicene theology to talk about eternal sonship. If you decide that doesn't answer your question and you're not satisfied with that pro-Nicene answer, then you're going to keep shopping. You're going to go to this relation and try to make it work as grounding the triune relation. So this is why EFS flourishes most in a context where you're iffy on eternal generation. Either you just deny it or you're unclear on it. And also social Trinitarianism. If you're a little bit more social about things, such that you think of the Father as having his own will that he operates, and then the Son who has his own distinct personal will, which he then, eternally properly negotiates with the Fathers, but it's a different faculty.
Playing devil's advocate, Fred, what would you say to someone who basically, hears what you're saying, but wants to respond and say that, no, actually what it means to be a perfect son is to be obedient and submissive, because that's like what sonness means. And he wouldn't be a perfect and good son if he weren't also submissive and obedient in these types of things. How would you respond to something like that?
Yeah, Bart makes that move right in 4.2, and you get it in some of the EFS arguments. Yeah, it's a good point, and what's tricky about it is doing a kind of biblical theology of sonship, and that's what makes it attractive. I just think it reintroduces, it introduces into the conversation categories of obedience, which then you have to sort of work back up into the eternal being of God and say, well, it was already hard to talk about fromness or origin in God. Now I'm going to have to talk about it sort of combined with obedience. And that introduces lordship and power and authority issues. And
then you're back to where you were before. So.
Yeah. The thing is, you've got to do this work at some point based on biblical revelation and sort of the conceptual clarification of it so you can understand it accurately. And the classic answer is to do that at the level of sonship, with sonship not meaning all the rich possible things that sonship could mean in a historical actuality, but specifically meaning this relation of origin.
And on top of that, we would posit, or we would we would register all of the biblical data that talks about obedience and etc. in the created order for exactly these types of reasons.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's ignored. It's done justice to, and arguably, it, in my opinion, is done as good a justice as you can possibly do. Yeah, because it links up in the created order to what the Son is essentially.
Yeah.
It's matching and fitting, and so all of the submission you want is actualized historically in time, so to speak, so that what the Son is eternally, naturally, the natural outgrowth of that is this creaturely obedience, as it were.
Yeah. I mean, I'm willing to, this is a speculative move, like what is the imminent basis of what we see in the economic whatever. You could talk about filial obedience, costly obedience that the incarnate Son carries out with regard to the will of the Father. You could say, well, what is the eternal imminent basis of that?
Right.
The problem is that you can't answer that in very much detail without smuggling command and obey structures up into the being of God. And that's just one of those things where once you've done that, you have to admit, okay, I must have divided by 0 at some point, because this solution is not acceptable for larger reasons than the operations I was just carrying out. Like,
got it.
I got to check my work. Every step seemed right, but I must have blown it somewhere.
That's really good.
Yeah.
That's good.
All right, last little bit that Junius does here to wrap up the sonship discussion is he's got the two, when none of the nouns here are good, he's got the two modes, right? He's got the twofold kingship.
Mode always works. So we
Yeah,
don't know
exactly. Yeah, I see no problems with using that word. That won't remind anyone of anything heretical.
Yeah.
But he's talking about the kingship in these two ways, and says, under the concept of the first mode, the Son is king according to nature. Under the concept of the second mode, he is king according to voluntary dispensation. And under the concept of each, he is true God. This is because in the second and more debased mode of kingdom, he could not reign if he were not God. So it's an important reminder, and I think in what we were talking about, we were obeying this rule throughout. We didn't make any false moves that I recall. But you might think of the first mode as grounding the deity of Christ, and the second mode as grounding, well, the humanity of Christ, right? You could sort things that way. And Junius's point is, no, kingship in both modes is reflecting the deity of Christ.
Yeah, I want to reach for the Bardian and hypostatic versus on-hypostatic issue here, because I think he's really pointing out very, very strongly that when we dip down to theanthropos, theandric stuff, as it were, very technical theandric stuff, we're never, there's no human nature out there dancing around in the world.
Yeah.
And I think that's being brought in very strongly here.
Yeah, and even if you're looking at this theandric kingship, it's not like deputy kingship or something. It's as Junius reminds us right at the end, like even in the debased mode of kingdom, he couldn't reign if he were not God.
Yeah,
this is not, there are all kinds of rulers. They're all sort of created rulers over created ruled structures within a complex creation that's got multiple kinds of hierarchies going on within it, and hierarchies that change, and all sorts of systems and structures. But if you're talking about the kind of ruling that Christ does, even when it's in his hands as the kingship that he condescends to take on for us and our salvation, it's still a proof of his deity. Otherwise, it would just be one of these created authority structures within creation. All right, well, this is the last thing that Junius does under what he's thinking of as the names of God, which demonstrate the deity of Christ. More specifically, the names common to the entire Godhead, or all three persons of the Trinity, which nevertheless give us insight into the deity of Christ. They're getting, when you go from Yahweh to Elohim to King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and then further to reflect on kingship and lordship, they're getting less like names. They're getting more and more abstract as we go and more general, from Yahweh to kingship.
Mm-hmm.
They're almost turning into attributes. And so it's kind of the natural segue point for what he's going to go into next, where he's actually going to turn to attributes and talk about those in the father-son relation.
All right.
All right. Well, we'll take that up next time.